Do you ever look at everything going on in the Catholic Church and just step back and ask yourself, why is this happening? I mean, in the big picture, in the scope of God's providence, why is He allowing this to happen? We, of course, have no ultimate answer, as no one knows the mind of God, and overly simple explanations like He's punishing us are a little too basic to cover every facet of the problem, although I do believe a chastisement is part of it. When contemplating this question, I have often found that it makes more sense considered in light of the Church's history. Catholic traditionalism is right to value the heritage handed down from previous generations, but we should not imagine that the past was some kind of Catholic golden age. When you really dig down into the study of history, you quickly divest yourself of the notion that there were ever any golden ages. Every age has its virtues and every age has its vices. If some ages are preferable to others, it's because they excelled in a certain quality that we happen to value, like art, education, or piety. Just like we Catholics may idealize the 13th century because of the vibrancy of its intellectual life and its glorious architecture. But every age has its own challenges, and it is only future generations that have the luxury of designating a past age golden, something seldom done by the people living through such times. The 13th century, for example, was rife with eschatological expectation, as the people who were actually living then considered their times so depraved and disordered that they assumed the end of the world must be at hand. In a certain sense, the church has always been on the verge of collapse. Let's take a little trip down memory lane, shall we? In the first 5 centuries, it was the Roman persecutions and the Arian heresy. Then, the threat of Islam, followed immediately by the ravages of the Norse, which upended monastic life across Northern Europe. The Roman Church was then plunged immediately into the dark ages of the pornocracy, followed by its century of subjugation to the Holy Roman Emperors. Emerging victorious from the struggle against lay domination in the early 12th century, the Latin West was quickly paralyzed by the catastrophic spread of Albigensianism, which reached its height in the mid-13th century, even as Emperor Frederick II, who was nicknamed the Antichrist, engaged in a life and death struggle against the papacy. The end of that century saw the struggle between Boniface VIII and King Philip IV of France, culminating in Boniface's exile and death and the beginning of the Avignon papacy, followed by the Great Schism, together a 109-year period that did irreparable harm to the integrity of the papacy. Destabilized by plague, undermined by simony, challenged by Lollards, conciliarists, and Hussites, fighting against the increasingly belligerent demands of the secular monarchs, the church was beleaguered on every front. The Fifth Lateran Council, which definitively put down the conciliarist movement, ended only 7 months before Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses. The next century and a half saw Christendom split down the middle with the total extinction of Catholicism in certain countries. The end of the religious wars in 1648 ushered in the age of the Enlightenment and the deist challenge to the faith, as for the first time, the church had to contend with outright atheism. And this gave rise, of course, to the Masonic movement and the age of the bloody revolutions, with their ensuing anti-clericalism that led to repression and persecution in every country where it took hold. The year 1870 saw anti-Catholic regimes come to power in France and Italy, the latter of which deprived the papacy of the temporal holdings it had governed for a millennium. Then came modernism, World War I, fascism, communism, World War II, all of which wrought indescribable destruction to Catholic communities, inaugurating a crisis of faith among Catholic leaders as they questioned what response the Church could offer in the face of such reckless hate. This, of course, prompted the Second Vatican Council, with its attendant chaos, the collapse of the missions, the emptying of seminaries and convents, the liturgical crisis, all unfolding alongside the unparalleled secularization of society, gender ideology, wokeness, and all the evils of our own day. Now, I don't pretend that all these crises are alike. Some of them are external, some of them are internal, but they are all crises nonetheless. And if we view church history through its crises, we see that really Catholicism has never been secure. It has always been on the edge, always been just a few catastrophes away from collapse. Now, of course, the church has never actually collapsed, at least not completely. After all, its indefectibility is guaranteed by the promise of the Holy Spirit. But we see that there is a tremendous flexibility in how it exists in any given circumstances. These circumstances have often been the catalysts for developments in worship and governance. This has all been part of God's plan for the growth of the church, both in terms of its institutional development, but also in the accumulation of wisdom, the collective memory of the successes and failures of 1,000 crises dispersed across 20 centuries. If we truly believe that the development of the church through all this was providential, that the forms the church assumed in its worship and governance were dictated to some degree by a deliberate plan of God, then we have to assume the same is true for our own day. We must assume that this is the means through which God is equipping the church of today with the wisdom and experience it will need to grapple with future crises of which we, as of yet, can have no conception. As I said, I do believe there is a chastening aspect to this, but we should recall the words of the book of Hebrews. For the Lord disciplines him whom he loves and chastises every son whom he receives. When the Lord chastens, it is remedial. It is like the pruning of a plant, which happens so that the plant might maintain its vigor and grow in the manner and direction willed by the gardener. The potter is shaping the vessel of the church in ways we cannot yet foresee. Of course, the church is not inert in all of this. The church, though divinely constituted and guided, is still a human institution. This means that we are instrumental in what is happening through our responses to it. Throughout history, the church has grown and adapted, not in the abstract, but through the ideas and the concrete actions of individual Catholics acting in response to whatever providence has chosen to confront them with. The future is determined in how we grapple with these problems today. I have often wondered whether the traditional backlash against the progressive experiment will not end up being a mechanism through which God forges the church of the future, if it will not be one aspect in the church's unfolding development. Now, we can see a beautiful movement here as our attempts to discern God's providence end up bringing us back inevitably to the only point where we can really make a difference, our own actions. When we say we'd rather not live through such trials as we see today, the words of Gandalf, though cliché, do demonstrate the correct disposition. So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. We may wish we weren't living through such harrowing times, but we must also consider that if we believe in God at all, then that means He specifically willed you to live and be Catholic in this particular time and place. And that should be a consolation. This is your fight. Here is your battle. Here is your cross. This is your pain right here and nowhere else. So what is God doing? The question should not be, what is God doing, but rather, what am I doing? As St. Augustine said, bad times, hard times, this is what people keep saying, but let us live well, and the times shall be good. We are the times. Such as we are, such are the times. Now, this doesn't mean that merely living well will solve the church's problems, but living well will at least ensure that you are part of the solution, whatever God in his providence decides that will be, and not just another facet of the crisis.